Another is conversion, they've labeled that, where an institution or policy designed with one set of goals in mind is directed to some other end. And an example of that is actually given in the Mahoney and Fielding book, where the focus of the early anti-poverty programs was poverty. It wasn't racialized. Most of you may think of it as a racialized, maybe it was implicitly racialized, but it was focused on poverty. And, but at the same time, that was a time when there was a lot of civic unrest, of course, and a lot of civil rights activity, and those funds were seen as a way to funnel resources into black communities. Not such a bad thing, but the economic and employment policies that were part of this policy became detached from a broader constituency of all poor people and made them much more vulnerable later to cuts when the anti-government Reagan ideology was ascendant. So we see that all of these mechanisms contribute to incremental change, and we can see that in the healthcare reform effort. All right, we see little bits of changes here and there. Is it reform? Structural reform? No, of course not. But they displaced a few things. They layered on a few things. It's a kind of weak effort to say, well, we'll do what we can do. Maybe it's better than nothing. Maybe it isn't better than nothing, but that's what usually happens. So we see the healthcare reform legislation, Howard Dean saying, look, this wouldn't do anything because it expands private insurers' monopoly over healthcare and transfers millions of taxpayer dollars to private corporations. And as Victor's been saying, it doesn't change anything structurally, really. So how can we then make real, significant, sustained change in these path-dependent, deeply layered structural forms that we're concerned about when we think about structural racialization? Well, that's been addressed to some extent by political scientists who looked at path-dependent, self-reinforcing systems like, say, Ireland, and how they've gone from a long, long period of just killing each other to a settlement which has now lasted for more than 10 years, maybe somewhat tenuous, but how did they come to that? And when they studied things like that, those case studies of those kinds of much more deeply layered structural changes, what they came up with was that you had to have simultaneous shifts in power relations, rebalancing power, modes of power, shifts in social norms, frames, policies, procedures, shifts in resources, in opportunities, knowledge, and capital. And in addition, shifts in social networks and boundaries that coordinate these social components. And you might think that you could just change one of them, change the power relations, and then all of it would just fall into place. Isn't it structural? No, that isn't how it works. What their studies show is that all of this has to change simultaneously in order to break the path-dependent pattern. At the same time, you have to be aware that when all of these things are shifting, there's going to be new contestations arising. People will be trying to do it the old way and struggling with what's coming. There are going to be new contestations over values, resources, and power that are going to rise out of this. And so change agents are going to have to be able to assess these dimensions before they begin this change process, and then assess them and the interplay between them as they engage and support the change process itself. So where does that bring us to structural racialization and structural change? We see that structural racialization is deeply layered, right, in the intersecting structural forms that constitute our larger society. So structural change is going to require simultaneous, coordinated efforts to identify and shift power relations, these racialized power hierarchies, and modes of power that reinforce the racial status quo, shifts in schemas, the racialized norms, communication frames around race, racialized policies, relational interactive patterns, the enactment of these as we interact with one another, shifts in resources and the racialized distribution of economic, political, and social capital and these opportunity structures, and shifts in networks and boundaries. Looking at the shifting racial boundaries, the social closure of those boundaries, and the political relevance of those boundaries for leveraging change. Now, that's a big order. So what are the implications of this for community building? How do we take this to the community level? Because you can see that embarking on community building in the context of deeply layered structural racialization is going to call for simultaneous activity on many different fronts. Because you're going to be disrupting path-dependent processes, building new connections and institutional arrangements, and also enhancing community's sense of agency and reworking agency and how it's understood in that community. And at the same time, you'll have to have this ongoing responsiveness to the new contestations that are going to rise within the community itself. And I'm not telling you what they're going to be, but you at least need to anticipate that they're going to be there. And with the larger social entities around them, the communities, etc., and with among the people who are involved in the change process itself. You'll see the old authority structures arise among the change agents, and reproducing this power, top-down power will happen. And you need to expect it and be prepared to think about how to work that through, because it'll just impede people if they're just reenacting the same old structural elements again and again and again. But understanding this at least gives you some handle on what you want to be watching for and looking at. Then after that, need to the next step
there's that.
is creating an interactive arena for change. First thing you got to do is recognize that and value the agency of all the social entities most affected by the change process. Remember, nothing's going to change if agency isn't moving in tandem. And engage those agents in identifying, planning, and implementing their own ideas for change, and providing support for the change process. But at the same time, you need to be beginning then to create an interactive arena for change that evokes new experiences of efficacy and power. Remember, because you have to address this interface. And how do you do that? Got to build into the process the inclusion of all the stakeholders, not just the people who live in the community, but all the people who are involved in this change process as major contributors to the change process. Establishment of a sense of safety and trust among the stakeholders. It's not going to be easy, right? All the old structural forms mitigate against it. And people are suspicious, and it takes time. This is a slow process to gain people's trust and to begin to work with them. And then a commitment, this needs to be built in, to openness of all to value that, to understanding the perceptions and perspectives of others. When people's perceptions and perspectives have been disvalidated again and again, there has to be a way of having new experiences and interaction. And recognizing the validity of those perceptions. They're not wrong. They're right if you're looking at them from the perspective of the person who's making them. And a willingness of all the stakeholders to reflect on their experience. So you need an interactional understanding of the way this recursive enactment works and will continue to work to push things back in the old direction if you're going to move in a new direction. You need to start with an assessment by all the stakeholders, first of the large-scale political, social, and economic transformations that are going on around the community that are generating pressures for change. And the essential nature of the local community, norms, power relations, resources, social networks, community access to a sense of agency. And this is slow, deliberate work. It doesn't happen overnight. Remember, we talked about some of those faster shifts taking a generation or two. So this is something where you need to be thinking about the groundwork and how you lay it down and get it going, because little efforts in one direction or another are just not going to be sufficient. You see that, right? We need to be building community toward by elaborating and taking comprehensive initiatives that make at least incremental shifts in shifting the balance of power. Maybe addressing structural violence, for instance. Shifting racialized policies, rules, and procedures. Shifting community values through reframing cultural representations and norms, lifting up norms that foster community life. Shifting resources. And building these intra and inter-community networks across race and class to coalitions that will leverage this change. So that's where you're going to be going you probably will be going incrementally, but you need to be thinking about doing all of those things at once. And we can see that Susan's work is working on the valley, the reframing the norms, and you know, that all has to be working together. The power, nobody's really talked about power yet. Power is absolutely, utterly important. Power is one of the major contributors to the need, this keeping things the way they are. So we need to think about what's going on and begin to make incremental change on all of these. It's only one of them. You know, oh, we can't do them all, I'll just do one, is not going to be effective in really making for structural change. Once we have some understanding of the structural community dynamics, it should guide our engagement and change efforts. Lots of times we start real small with intra-community activities that foster safety, trust, and collaboration. Remember how important that is to getting going. And advocacy actions in response to community-identified concerns. Through that, it leads to emerging community goals and initiatives, and Linda's work has shown that. Opportunities for reflection and reworking relational patterns, both within the community and with the larger world, and a widening scope of community involvement and vision. And to coordinated, focused community efforts that shift racialized structural forms in the direction of effective and sustainable structural change.